We were told it was a story about magic hair and a girl who needed saving. We were told the tower was enchanted, the witch was merely vain, and love conquered all. We were told this was a fairy tale. The archives reveal something else entirely. In the winter of 1634, somewhere in the war-torn principalities of what we now call Germany, a child disappeared, not into a magical tower, but into the suffocating silence that swallowed thousands of girls whose only crime was existing in a world that had no use for them. The story we call Rapunzel is not fantasy. It is testimony, a forensic record of captivity, predation, and the systematic destruction of a human life, sanitized over centuries until the blood was scrubbed clean and replaced with Disney songs. The Brothers Grimm knew this. In their 1812 manuscript, before the revisions, before the censorship, before the lie became legend, they recorded the truth. Rapunzel does not leave her prison because she is rescued. She is thrown out because she is pregnant. The prince does not fight heroically for love. He jumps in blind panic, and his eyes are torn from his skull by thorns. This is not the story of a girl who needed saving. This is the story of a girl who was never meant to be saved at all. But to understand the true horror of what happened in that tower, we must first understand the world that built it. The year is 1634. The 30 Years' War has been devouring Central Europe for 16 years, and the countryside bleeds, not metaphorically, literally. The soil itself is stained with the decomposition of armies that swept through these lands like locusts, leaving behind a wasteland of burnt crops, poisoned wells, and mass graves that no one bothers to mark anymore. The sweet pastoral Germany of fairy tale illustrations never existed. This Germany reeks. Walk through any surviving village in this era, and the first thing that assaults you is the smell. Not the clean pine scent of Black Forest tourism brochures, but the thick, cloying stench of bodies that have not been properly washed in months. Water is precious when wells run dry or become contaminated with corpses. The metallic tang of rusted iron hangs in the air from abandoned weapons, broken plows, and the chains that bind those too weak to flee. Wood smoke burns constantly, acrid and choking, as families huddle around fires fed with whatever will burn: furniture, books, sometimes the bones of animals long since eaten. In this world, a head of lettuce is not a garnish. It is salvation. The rampion plant, the Rapunzel that gives our story its name, contains vitamin C that can mean the difference between life and death during a winter of scurvy. When the grim tale tells us that a pregnant woman craves this plant so desperately she will die without it, we are not reading about whimsical pregnancy cravings. We are reading about malnutrition, so severe that the body begins consuming itself. The father who trades his unborn child for a handful of greens is not making a magical pact with a supernatural being. He is making the same calculation that thousands of starving peasants make every day, which life can be sacrificed so that others might survive. The tower itself is no fairy tale spire reaching toward the clouds. It is a reflection of institutions that dot this landscape like tombstones: the spinning houses, the Magdalene asylums, the correctional cloisters where inconvenient girls disappear. These are not magical prisons. They are architectural manifestations of a society's solution to the problem of female sexuality. Girls who show signs of independence, who attract unwanted attention, who become pregnant outside of marriage, who simply exist too visibly in a world that prefers them invisible, are locked away. The law treats children as chattel and women's bodies as vessels of sin that must be contained, controlled, purified through isolation. Inside these towers, the sensory experience is one of deliberate deprivation. The walls are thick stone, damp with condensation that never quite dries. Run your fingers along the surface, and they come away gritty with mold and mineral deposits that have seeped through the masonry for decades. The air tastes of rust and decay, heavy with the exhalations of previous occupants who may have died in these same rooms. There are no carpets, no tapestries, no comfort of any kind. Just bare stone that holds the cold like a living thing, radiating it through thin clothing and into bones that never quite warm. The silence is perhaps the worst part. Not the peaceful quiet of a library or a church, but the oppressive absence of human connection that presses against the eardrums like water pressure. When wind does penetrate the chamber, whistling through gaps in the ancient masonry, the sound is indistinguishable from screaming. Whether it is the wind or the echo of voices that once filled this space, no one can say. No one asks. Light enters through a single opening, high above, casting one grey shaft that moves across the floor with the passage of the sun. Watch that light long enough, and you begin to understand how a mind breaks. The dust motes that dance in its beam become companions. The way shadows shift and change becomes a calendar, the only way to mark time when days bleed into weeks, weeks into months, months into years of identical, suffocating routine. The girl in this tower wears coarse wool that has never been properly cleaned. It scratches against skin that has grown pale and sensitive from lack of sunlight. Her hair, the famous hair of legend, is not silken and golden. It is unwashed, heavy with oil and the accumulated grime of confinement. When it is braided and lowered from the window, it carries the sour smell of her captivity, the rancid scent of a body that has been denied basic hygiene for so long that cleanliness becomes a forgotten concept. The forest that surrounds this prison is not the enchanted woodland of children's books. It is a place where civilization has retreated, leaving behind only the most desperate and dangerous. The trees grow too close together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sky. The undergrowth is thick with thorns that catch at clothing and tear skin. These are not rose thorns, pretty and pink, but the vicious barbs of wild blackberry and hawthorn, evolved to draw blood and discourage passage. The copper scent of dried blood on these thorns is not metaphorical. Animals wounded while foraging leave their mark here. So do humans. Walk through this forest, and the silence is absolute. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but the oppressive hush of a place where sound itself seems to die. Your own footsteps become unnaturally loud, the crunch of frost-killed vegetation under bare feet echoing off the tree trunks like gunshots. The air is thick enough to feel, pressing against exposed skin with the weight of accumulated moisture and decay. Breathe too deeply, and you taste it. The sweet rot of fallen leaves, the metallic tang of stagnant water, the underlying sourness of things that have died and been left to decompose where they fell. This is the world that creates monsters. Not supernatural beings with magical powers, but human predators who understand that in times of chaos and desperation, certain crimes become invisible. The woman who takes the child, who builds the tower, who maintains the prison, is not a witch in the fantastical sense. She is something far more terrifying, a human being who has learned to exploit the systematic devaluation of female life for her own purposes. In the original telling, before the sanitization, before the happy ending was grafted onto a story that never had one, we catch glimpses of the truth. The girl becomes pregnant, not through romantic love, but through repeated assault. The prince, if he can even be called that, is not a hero but a participant in her victimization. When he discovers the consequences of his actions, he does not fight to save her, he runs. And when he falls, when the thorns tear into his eyes, it is not noble sacrifice, but cowardly panic that destroys him. The girl is cast out, not because she has been rescued, but because she is no longer useful. Pregnancy has made her a liability, a visible reminder of crimes that must remain hidden. She is thrown into a wilderness that shows no mercy to the weak, the injured, the alone. The twins she bears are not symbols of hope and renewal, but evidence of trauma that will follow her for the rest of her shortened life. This is the story we have been telling our children for generations, dressed up in pretty pictures and set to cheerful music. We have taken testimony of systematic abuse and transformed it into entertainment. We have made a fairy tale from a crime scene, and in doing so we have ensured that the real victims remain forever silent, their suffering transformed into someone else's happy ending. The tower still stands, metaphorically speaking. In every society that treats women as property, in every system that makes children disappear when they become inconvenient, in every institution that prioritizes reputation over justice. The girl in the tower is still there, still waiting, still silent. And we are still telling ourselves that it is just a story. But stories have power, and the truth, once buried, has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. Dawn broke on November 15, 1348, with the metallic taste of rusted iron keys hanging in the air, like a promise of what was to come. The monastery bells had fallen silent 3 days prior, their bronze tongues stilled by the same plague that had already claimed half the village. But this morning, the silence carried a different weight, a different texture of dread. Brother Thomas descended the stone steps to the lower chambers, each footfall echoing against walls that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. The smell of damp, mouldering stone filled his nostrils, that particular scent of places where water seeps through mortar and time itself seems to rot. His fingers traced the rough-hewn walls as he moved deeper into the monastery's bowels, where the accused waited. The children had been brought in the night before, 7 of them, ranging in age from barely walking to the cusp of adolescence. Their crime, according to the fevered testimonies of the dying villagers, was simple and unforgivable. They had survived when others had not. In a world where God's wrath manifested as bubonic death, survival itself had become suspicious. The children's laughter in the midst of universal mourning had been interpreted as evidence of their unholy alliance. By noon the interrogations had begun in earnest. The sound of wind whistling through a gap in the masonry created an endless backdrop of what might have been screaming, or might have been nothing more than air moving through stone. Brother Thomas found it increasingly difficult to distinguish between the two as the hours wore on. The texture of his coarse, unwashed wool habit scratched against his skin, a constant reminder of the penance he believed he was performing in God's name. The children wore simple shifts, their feet bare against the cold stone. The youngest, a girl of perhaps 4 years, had been found playing with dolls made of straw, while her parents lay dead in their cottage. This image haunted the interrogators more than any confession might have. How could innocence persist in the face of such devastation, unless it was not innocence at all, but something far more sinister? The overwhelming copper scent of dried blood on thorns drifted through the chamber's single window. Outside, the rose garden that had once been the monastery's pride now grew wild and untended, its thorns catching fabric and flesh from the bodies of those who had collapsed while trying to tend it in their final days. The roses themselves had turned a deep, unnatural red, as if they had been feeding on something other than soil and rain. As the afternoon sun reached its zenith, a single grey ray of light moved across the dust-covered floor of the interrogation chamber. It illuminated nothing and revealed everything. The instruments of inquiry laid out with ecclesiastical precision, the stains on the stone that spoke of previous sessions, the way the children's eyes had already begun to glaze with the particular emptiness that comes not from death, but from the complete abandonment of hope. The questioning followed the prescribed forms. Had they consorted with demons? Had they made pacts with the devil himself? Had they brought the plague upon the village through their unholy practices? The children's denials grew weaker with each passing hour, not because they were guilty, but because they were beginning to understand that guilt and innocence had become irrelevant concepts in this new world order. Brother Thomas recorded each response in his careful script, the scratch of his quill against parchment providing a counterpoint to the children's increasingly ragged breathing. He told himself he was serving God, that these procedures were necessary to cleanse the community of evil. But in the silence of the forest that surrounded the monastery, a silence so deep it felt like pressure in the ears, he sometimes heard whispers that suggested otherwise. By dusk, the confessions had begun, not because the children were guilty, but because human beings, even very small ones, will eventually say anything to make suffering stop. The youngest girl admitted to dancing with demons in the moonlight. A boy of 7 confessed to poisoning the village well with his tears. An older girl, perhaps 12, claimed she had learned to fly by night and rain death upon the sleeping. The crunching sound of frost-killed vegetation under bare feet marked the final procession. The children were led from the stone chambers to the courtyard where the pyre waited. Their feet, blue with cold, left small prints in the frost that would melt with the morning sun, erasing the last evidence of their passage through this world. The sour breath of their captors, standing too close, mingled with the smoke that would soon rise. Brother Thomas felt the visceral tug of his own conscience, straining against his scalp like heavy hair pulled too tight. But conscience, like the children's protests, had become a luxury the community could no longer afford. The flames consumed everything, flesh, bone, memory, and with them the last vestiges of the world that had existed before the plague. In the morning, the villagers would wake to a landscape cleansed not just of disease, but of the uncomfortable questions that survival, in the midst of mass death, inevitably raises. The children's laughter would never again disturb the proper order of mourning. But here, in this moment between dusk and true darkness, as the smoke rose and dispersed into the indifferent sky, something fundamental about human nature revealed itself. It was not the capacity for evil that had led to this moment, but something far more disturbing, the capacity for ordinary people to convince themselves that their most monstrous acts were not only justified, but necessary. The plague would eventually run its course. The village would slowly repopulate. New children would be born and would grow and would laugh in gardens where roses bloomed red. But the precedent had been set. The template established for how communities respond when faced with incomprehensible suffering. When the world stops making sense, humans do not seek understanding. They seek someone to blame. This pattern would repeat itself across centuries and continents. In Salem, frightened villagers would see witchcraft in the seizures of young girls. In Europe, entire communities would convince themselves that their Jewish neighbors were poisoning wells. In Rwanda, radio broadcasts would transform neighbors into enemies overnight. In each case, the mechanism would be the same, the transformation of inexplicable suffering into explicable guilt, the conversion of random tragedy into purposeful punishment. The children who died that November evening in 1348 were neither the first nor the last to be sacrificed on the altar of collective anxiety. They were simply the most honest victims, too young to understand that survival itself could be construed as a crime, too innocent to craft the elaborate lies that might have saved them. Their deaths served a function that transcends individual tragedy. They provided a community in crisis with the illusion of control, the comforting fiction that suffering has meaning and can therefore be prevented through the proper application of violence. The villagers who watched the flames did not see murder. They saw medicine. They did not witness the destruction of innocence. They celebrated the restoration of divine order. This is why we tell ourselves fairy tales about evil witches and wicked stepmothers, about monsters that can be slain and curses that can be broken. We need to believe that darkness has a face, a name, a specific address, where it can be cornered and destroyed. The alternative, accepting that suffering often has no meaning and death frequently chooses its victims at random, is too terrifying for most human minds to accommodate. The real horror of that November evening was not the children's deaths, but the ease with which an entire community convinced itself that these deaths were not only acceptable but necessary. The real tragedy was not the flames, but the relief that followed them. The real evil was not supernatural, but entirely, recognizably human. We are the inheritors of this legacy, the descendants of those who chose to burn children rather than confront the possibility that some questions have no answers. In our DNA, we carry the genetic memory of both victims and perpetrators, the capacity for both suffering and the infliction of suffering. When we encounter inexplicable tragedy in our own time, when diseases spread without regard for virtue, when violence strikes without warning or apparent reason, we face the same choice our ancestors faced in 1348. We can accept the terrifying randomness of existence, or we can find someone to blame. Most of us, if we are honest, will choose blame. We will construct elaborate theories about who deserves what and why. We will identify the guilty parties and demand their punishment. We will transform the chaos of existence into the comforting narrative of justice served. And in doing so, we will prove that the children who died in 1348 did not die in vain. They died to teach us something essential about ourselves, that we are capable of any atrocity, provided we can convince ourselves it serves a greater good. The smoke from that long-ago pyre still rises somewhere in the human heart, still carries the scent of our deepest shame and our most persistent delusion. We are not the heroes of our own stories. We are the villagers who watch the flames and call them holy. The final timeline unfolds with the precision of a coroner's report. Each hour documented, each moment catalogued in the ledger of human cruelty. Dawn breaks on the 7th month, the 21st day. In the tower room that has served as both nursery and cell, Rapunzel stands before a shard of broken mirror, her hands pressed against the fabric that no longer conceals what her body has become. The morning light filters through the single window, illuminating the confusion in her eyes as she traces the curve that speaks of life growing within death. 6 hours and 43 minutes past sunrise, Gothel's footsteps echo on the stone stairs. The rhythm is different today, urgent, predatory. She has been watching, calculating, waiting for this moment when innocence would reveal its own violation. The door opens without ceremony. No greeting, no pretense of maternal care. Only the cold assessment of a warden discovering contraband. The interrogation begins at noon. Gothel's voice cuts through the tower's silence like a blade through silk. Where did this come from? How did this happen? The questions fall upon a girl who has been deliberately kept ignorant of her own anatomy, who understands neither the mechanics of conception nor the reality of her condition. Rapunzel's stammered responses reveal the depth of her isolation, the completeness of her educational neglect. She speaks of the visiting prince as one might describe a dream, uncertain whether their encounters were real or imagined. By 2 in the afternoon, Gothel's composure fractures. The careful construction of 18 years crumbles in the face of biological inevitability. The girl she has molded, controlled, possessed, has become something beyond her dominion. The pregnancy represents not just physical evidence of intrusion, but the ultimate failure of her surveillance state. Someone has breached her fortress. Someone has claimed what she considered exclusively hers. The shearing begins at 3:17. Each cut of the blade strips away more than hair, more than beauty. It removes identity, agency, the very symbol that has defined Rapunzel's existence. The golden strands fall to the stone floor like shed skin, like discarded dreams. Gothel works in silence now, her fury expressed through the violence of her scissors, the brutality of her method. She is not just removing hair, she is performing an execution. Sunset arrives at 6:41, painting the tower walls the color of dried blood. Rapunzel, shorn and broken, is led down the stairs for the last time. Her bare feet know each stone, each crack, each imperfection of her prison. But today they carry her toward exile, toward a wilderness that represents not freedom but abandonment. Gothel speaks only once during this final journey. "You are no longer mine." The wasteland receives her at 7:15 as the last light fades from the western sky. Pregnant, traumatized, stripped of everything that once defined her, Rapunzel stumbles into a landscape as barren as her future. Behind her, the tower stands empty, its purpose fulfilled, its victim expelled. The wilderness stretches endlessly ahead, offering neither shelter nor salvation, only the harsh democracy of survival. The prince returns at 9:33, climbing the tower wall with practiced ease, expecting to find his secret preserved, his pleasure waiting. Instead, he discovers Gothel's trap, the severed hair that sends him plummeting into thorns that tear away his sight as surely as his actions tore away innocence. The irony is surgical in its precision. The man who refused to see the consequences of his desires is rendered literally blind to the world he helped destroy. By midnight, the tragedy is complete. The tower stands empty, its stones already beginning to forget the voices that once echoed within. The prince wanders sightless through forests that mirror his moral blindness. Rapunzel, heavy with unwanted life, learns the weight of survival in a world that has no place for damaged goods. 3 lives destroyed by a single act of commerce, a transaction that reduced a human being to property, to commodity, to thing. This is the timeline we refuse to acknowledge, the chronology we bury beneath layers of sanitized narrative. We prefer the fairy tale version because it offers redemption, because it suggests that love conquers all, because it allows us to sleep without confronting the mathematics of our own cruelty. But mathematics is merciless, and the numbers tell a different story. A child sold at birth. 18 years of imprisonment disguised as protection. 4 months of sexual exploitation disguised as romance. A pregnancy that reveals the lie at the heart of every fairy tale, that innocence can be preserved, that purity can be maintained, that love can exist without power, without consequence, without cost. We tell ourselves that Rapunzel and her prince find each other in the wilderness, that her tears heal his blindness, that they return to his kingdom to live happily ever after. We need this lie because the alternative is unbearable. The alternative is 2 broken people clinging to each other in the dark, survivors of a system that creates victims as efficiently as it creates fairy tales to explain them away. The truth is that they never leave the wasteland. The truth is that the prince's blindness cannot be healed, because it was never merely physical. The truth is that Rapunzel's trauma runs deeper than hair, deeper than imprisonment, deeper than the tower that shaped her understanding of the world. They are both casualties of a war between power and powerlessness, between those who take and those who are taken from. We sanitize these stories because we are complicit in their creation. Every time we fail to question the systems that reduce children to transactions, Every time we romanticize relationships built on inequality, every time we mistake possession for protection, we build another tower, weave another trap, sharpen another blade for the shearing. The fairy tale industry exists to launder our guilt, to transform our crimes into entertainment, to make palatable the unpalatable truth of what we do to our most vulnerable. We dress our monsters in the costumes of witches and stepmothers because acknowledging that they wear the faces of fathers and mothers, lovers and protectors, would require us to look too closely at ourselves. Rapunzel's story is not about magic or true love, or the triumph of good over evil. It is about the banality of evil, the ordinariness of cruelty, the way we normalize the abnormal until selling children becomes business, imprisonment becomes care, and exploitation becomes romance. It is about how we teach our victims to love their cages, to thank their captors, to blame themselves for their captivity. The tower still stands, not in some distant fairy tale kingdom, but in every home where children learn that love requires surrender, that safety demands silence, that survival means accepting the unacceptable. The hair still grows, not golden and magical, but ordinary and human, ready to be cut whenever it threatens to lift its owner too high, to see too far, to escape too completely. We are all Gothel, building towers to contain what we cannot control. We are all the merchant father, willing to trade innocence for security. We are all the prince, taking what we want and calling it love. And we are all Rapunzel, trapped in stories we did not write, paying prices we did not set, living lives we did not choose. The wasteland is not a place on any map. It is the space between what we are told and what we know, between what we hope and what we fear, between the fairy tale and the truth. It is where all our stories end, not with happily ever after, but with the simple, devastating acknowledgement that we have always been here, in the dark, telling ourselves lies to make the darkness bearable. The most terrifying prison is often a home, and the most dangerous fairy tale is the one that teaches us to love our chains.